He has written for most UK quality newspapers, as well as for the New York Times Book Review, and the Wall Street Journal, and is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. He is also a longtime member of the New York Society Library, so you will probably see him around the building. Please welcome Richard Cohen. I'm going to have to lift the microphone. I'm a bit shorter than you.
Thank you. Is that about right? Can everybody hear me? The other one says that, but if people can't hear me, they don't know what to say. You mentioned Hilary Mantel. We were talking just before you began about the size of the book. And I sent Hilary a copy of the last book I published in 2015, which was a book about writing. It's called How to Write Like Tolstoy. And she very nicely gave a blurb for the book. But what she did was, in the letter telling me about the blurb she'd given, she said, your book made me want to write down things on every page, often to disagree with you. And I felt so caught up in the book that it had all these blank pages at the end where the index was going to go. And I wrote a short story in blank pages. And of course, saying something like that, I thought, I wish I could say that to people, because it's such an enthusiastic and genuine response. But anyway, what she did say was enough. Anyway, thank you for your kind words. I think I'll go home now. I was looking at the arts pages in the New York Times yesterday, and the front page, one of the front page articles in the section, was about Francis Fukuyama. Always worried that I might mispronounce his name, and how some 30 odd years ago he'd published the book The End of History. And I mean, it was this clever title, if you like, selling title, arguing that with the decline of communism, the whole liberal belief in liberal democracy had entered a new stage and so on. But I thought the decline, the death of history, what does that really mean? And it's really that people use history, which they think is a simple word, which we read and use the whole time, as if they know what it means. And it seems strange to say that it's not so easy to know what it means. And I remember reading the critic John Lukács saying, well, actually, it's got two meanings. It means the past, but it means people's writings on the past, or paintings about the past, or movies about the past, people's versions of the past. In other words, we get our history through the filter of other people, with their prejudices and their agendas. And so it occurred to me in my kind of dim way that I'd like to read a book that really wrote about how the people who have most influenced us about the ideas we've had about the past, what they were like, and what their agendas were and the pressures on them. And the book didn't exist, so I thought I'd better write it. I suppose that a main theme is just how important people's personal lives and the pressures on them are. So I deal with, it's quite a list, the pressure of writing for money. How does that affect what you write? The pressures of patronage, political pressures, religious pressures, health pressures. For instance, it's jumping ahead a bit, but when I was a publisher, I published several books by the military historian John Keegan. Now, John Keegan, I think, is a great historian and really changed the way that military history has been written. At the age of 11, was diagnosed with having TB in his hip. And he was in and out of hospital and awful, you don't want to know what he had to go through. And even though he was effectively cured, he went from that, by the end of his life, he was like a question mark, a wonderful man. But while he was in a particular ward in hospital, he found himself, this being shortly after the Second World War, with a whole lot of squaddies, basic infantrymen, who were on the ward with him, and they kind of adopted him as the nephew that they would take care of, little Johnny. And it gave him an insight into the nature of war, which then went on to inform every book he wrote. The horror of war, what it was like to be at the sharp end as an infantryman, as a Scotty. And that gave him a kind of moral backbone to his writing, which I think what most distinguishes him really from any other military historian. And there's some very good ones. And the good ones who've been inspired by him. Anthony Trevor, Max Hastings, and so on. So there was an example of where someone's health or lack of health really conditioned how they approached history. People's love affairs also can affect the way people approach writing about the past. Voltaire, who had this long affair with a married woman, and would work with her, doing some amazing mathematical and scientific original work. Voltaire decided he would write a work of history. He wrote several during his lifetime, and very important ones too. Well, his mistress didn't approve of this, and she pinched the manuscript. She hid it, in fact. And it wasn't for some time afterwards that he managed to find it and have the book published. But there was the pressures of passionate love affecting what he should write, because he said, well, if you're going to be like that, I'm going to go on writing history. So you've got these amazing stories about how people were influenced in their personal lives. I mean, if you just take Edward Gibbon, who wrote this kind of masterwork, maybe the most famous work outside the Bible of a work which is history, who, with Voltaire actually, did something very important in the writing of history. Both of them were so fed up about the restrictions of the Christian church that they fought for historians, people who wrote generally, but particularly people who wrote works of history, to be freed from the constraint of a God in his heaven, the fact that you couldn't use your independent judgments in writing works of history, because you had to toe the line. Now, the 18th and particularly the 19th century saw a rush of books by people who felt that the Bible was untouchable, that the Christian faith was the only faith that mattered. And so there was this great war as to exactly what historians should be allowed to do if they weren't going to be involved in appalling apostasy. But Gibbon and Voltaire were at the center of that revolution. But Gibbon is 4'8". He was so ugly that there was a great Paris socialite who was blind, and in her late middle age ran one of the most famous salons in Paris. And the great and noble would come to her evening dues, and Gibbon was invited. And because she was blind, she would often ask guests to present their face to her, and she would feel their faces. Well, Gibbon, with his pouting lips and snub nose, presented his face, and she thought he was presenting his bottom. He was not invited again. But he also had, I won't read you, I'll find them in the book, his list of awful physical frailties and problems and so on. But he chose to write about the most worshipping of beauty societies in the world. The Roman Empire at the top and finally at the bottom of its time in history. And so if you're thinking, well, how much does ugliness affect the way you write about history? Gibbon's ironic tone, his love of taking down the worst of ancient Roman emperors, comes absolutely from, I won't say the venom, but all he had to suffer as someone who's so physically impaired, so ugly. So these agendas really have got to be what we bear in mind when we read any work of history. I begin the book with an epigraph from the British historian E.H. Carr, those who read history should first study the historian. And that, if you like, is the first theme running through the book. I try to avoid using the word historiography. Throughout, I think I had to use it twice, and I couldn't get out of it. But it really is me and my anecdotage, because the stories about these people are so amazing. A friend of mine came to my birthday, my 75th birthday, last Monday from London. And he said, "I'm loving your book, Richard. It's so full of gossip." And I thought, no, I'm not. I said, the Washington Post said the British historian Richard Cohen. That's all right. But it's the stories which tell you so much that arm you over how you should approach a particular piece of writing. And I remember that my history teacher, when I was at high school, said, don't just read one book on any event, read the opposite point of view as well, and make up your own mind. And ideally read more than two, because so many events require that. And one of the chapters in the book, I wanted to take some event which had over the decades different fashions of interpreting a particular historical event. And I thought, well, the First World War, particularly the Second World War, the French Revolution. But then I chose the American Civil War. And what you get, of course, is for really the first 60 years after that conflict, you had people say, you know, the North won the war, but the South won the peace. You get the South dictating what people should think about what caused the war, who was right and who was wrong, and the gallant South fighting against people who wanted to change their wonderful way of life, the kind, patriarchal way they treated those who were enslaved, and so on. And then after the 1920s, and what was called, referring to the South historians, the Dunning School. Dunning was one of the great professors of the time, and most of his pupils went on to have wonderful careers, historians in America, North as well as South. The Dunning School started being criticized, and you had then layers, you know, the communist version of the American Civil War, where, I can't remember saying the first name now, but Robert Beard saying, I don't mention slaves at all in my account of the causes of the Civil War, through to people who gave capitalist interpretations of the Civil War. And only belatedly, although of course C.R.B. Boyce was writing pretty early on, but he got terrible reviews. People said, this is just a Marxist account and he doesn't use proper sources. Well, the man couldn't use sources because they weren't made available to him. But you gradually get the arguments that slavery was at the heart of why the Civil War was fought. And even now, you've got differing versions about that, as you all know well. Now, in writing about this, and you know, it's not just the names which Carol kindly listed, but who knew that Machiavelli was a major historian? The Prince we know about, but he wrote some other important works, and again was part of that revolutionary group who was saying we're not going to be bounded by the old rules. And what are these old rules? There are old rules and new rules. If you look at the way history is, an activity has progressed, for a long time it wasn't being written on things of the past, again, differentiating between the past and writing about the past, interpreting the past. It wasn't something people would know what happened to their parents, maybe their grandparents, but it wasn't an activity or a way of thinking that people were interested in or invested in. But a society, if it's going to progress, has got to develop a sense of its past. And that's what happened when Herodotus came on the scene. He was flourishing around 400 BC. Well, fine, that's a good date. But think how many thousands of years human beings have been on the planet before Herodotus came along. and there were chronicles written. Ancient China and various other parts of the world had just mere dates and what happened on those dates, without any interpretation, any sense of narrative, any personal judgments being involved. So Herodotus and then Thucydides brought about almost the invention of history, the invention of writing personal accounts, narratives, stories about the past. And then you go from chronicles into annals, from annals into books that do involve judgment. And so you go through these revolutions, like some of which I've mentioned, until you reach the 19th century. That's quite a jump, about 400 pages jump. And you get to the German figure of Leopold von Ranke, who, when he was researching in Venice, discovered that the Venice archives, because Venice then was such a kind of subjugated state, they didn't, the doges of Venice weren't, as it were, selling their archive off to Austin, Texas, the ransom center or anything. He found that the diplomats sent out by Venice to all parts of Italy, to France, most of developed Western Europe, were sending back the most extraordinarily detailed and interesting reports. And no one had read them before. So this was gold dust, and he made his reputation using those reports for his first books. And then he thought to himself, remember this is the 19th century, the word science, the scientists, were words that had recently been developed. And he realized that scientists had careers for them, that scientists were given university posts and money and were admired. And so he thought, well, I'd rather like to have a cut of this. And so he set to developing history as, his word, a discipline. It had rules, the importance of primary sources, the need for evidence. He developed the whole notion of a doctorate. And before long, history, I mean, there had been professors of history before, but they didn't do much teaching, they didn't do much professing. It was really von Ranke who started up history as a recognized career path, a university job. And by the 1880s onwards, most of the leading universities in the world were changing their regulations, their input, and so on, to have history as a recognized subject. Now, he did an enormous lot of good, historians, but in an important way, he also did a big act of harm, because one of the themes of my book is that history is too important to be left to the historians, in the sense of the academy, professional historians. And so, I mean, there's a wonderful book published in 2009 by an Oxford classics professor called John Burrow, which is called The History of Histories. And the difference in my title is important because he doesn't really consider, can't avoid considering it a bit. But over a third of his book is just devoted to ancient Greece and ancient Roman historians and history. He is wonderful. He calls one medieval scholar, and Gregory of Tours, a French bishop, Ian Fleming without the bloodshed. So he had a sense of what his character should be. But I've included, unlike him, a chapter on Shakespeare. Now, talking about agendas, Shakespeare was a propagandist. He was writing as an advocate of the Tudor court. But it's Shakespeare in his history plays. I mean, he wrote 38 plays, maybe 39, depending on how you qualify authorship. And over half of them are histories in one way or another. But he mangles history. He uses it to his own advantage, to his propagandist ideals. And even so, his Richard III, which was the most successful play in his lifetime, pretty successful since, is our Richard III, with all the things he made up included in it. The brave Henry V is Shakespeare's. And then you've got the ancient Roman plays, Cleopatra, Mark Antony, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus. Those figures are Shakespeare's in our imaginations. So he may have been, I don't want to use the word tainted, but you can see where I'm going, a dramatist, but he gave us the drama of history. And he's probably more influential in terms of how we think of those 14 Plantagenets, let alone the Romans, than any other person who's ever written. I have a chapter on the Bible, the writers of the historical parts of the Bible. Now that's a hugely contentious chapter, because I show that the first 5 books of the Old Testament, well, people have accepted that perhaps Moses didn't write them. After all, a bit difficult to write one of the books about the death of Moses, if you're Moses. But throughout the 19th century on into the 20th century, as archaeologists came up with new discoveries, even the most conservative of biblical scholars found their beliefs were being pushed back in the light of new evidence. And so, in the end, it's not that contentious now, even amongst Christian academics, to say that the Bible is, first and foremost, a work of propaganda. It contains within its pages the most wonderful history, the most wonderful things of cultural value. But who was King David? Was there a King David? Where did he live? And what hold did he have over whatever property kingdoms he's meant to have ruled over? When the word we have for kingdom, understood within the language of the time, could mean just a village or a few straggly houses. So again, placing the Bible, the historical parts of the Bible, because it's so full of poems or parables, whatever, and placing those historical stories within the perspective of wonderfully created propagandist writings is to see history straight. I have a chapter on historical novelists, not least Hilary Mantel. And her argument, she gave the Wreath lectures 2 or 3 years ago, and she was saying, we know so little about the past, and those who are professional historians do us a valuable service, but often what it felt like to live at a particular time. You require the imaginative powers of the novelist. And Hilary's Thomas Cromwell trilogy probably, again, is a prime example of one author shaping a novelist, a storyteller, shaping our understanding of what that whole period was like, particularly, obviously, the figures of Cromwell, Thomas More, Wolsey, Henry VIII, and so on. Now, you can write giving a marvelous imaginative insight into the past, but also take someone like Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I used to love, I read them at high school, novels like Cancer War, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. And to an extent, they seem almost like journalism. But when he came to write the Goleg Trilogy, I was at British publisher William Collins then. I can remember the excitement that the first volume caused in all of those within the company. I mean, here was real history told by a novelist. What authority did it have? Well, I'll tell you what I think the authority it had. It changed the way we regarded that period in Soviet history more than any other work has changed any other period in history, any other fictional work, I should say. So it's not just that novelists are giving a kind of imaginative plus to our understanding of the past. They're often giving us a central understanding of it. That's why the great 19th century novelists, Stendhal, Flaubert, Balzac, and Zola, regarded themselves as social historians. They wanted to tell a good story, but they're also saying, well, actually, it's by storytelling that we can capture something about the past that maybe other kinds of writers haven't been able to do. So that was an important lodestar for me in writing the book. I mean, it's a chapter on journalists, you know, the first draft of history cliche. What value do you give to journalists who are there, an important issue, are there at the time? On the other hand, are they too close? How much context can they take in? One thinks not of the journalist, but of the Democrat politician Dean Acheson, who, when he was writing his memoirs, Precedent of the Creation, sent one section which he thought was very important to a friend of his. He said, look, it's important that this bit of my tale is correct. I think I've got it right in terms of what people said and the outcome of this big political discussion was. But you were there too, I need you to check it. And his friend wrote back and said, well, it really is remarkable. You have got everything right. The dialogue, people's tones of voice, the nature of the narrative and so on. There's only one problem. You weren't actually there. and you know, one finds throughout history people getting things wrong. And what I finish with is the final theme, and that is, it sounds like a tub-thumping minister. History is under attack. History has got to be saved. And by that I mean, there's a chapter in the book called Bad History. And in one sense, the chapter starts, I talk about some of the, we would say, funny pieces of bad history. Not just the myths of King Arthur or Robin Hood, or every society has its made-up myths. One famous mid-last century Chinese historian reckoned there were 2,000 years of ancient Chinese history which were totally fabricated, not a word of truth in them. So it goes through all societies. But I show that, well, I take two main examples. I take Japan and its history from 1931 to 1945, and I show that still in modern Japan, well, when MacArthur was there, and Japan was forced to admit things like the Nanking massacre and the use of the awful phrase comfort women, women forced to be prostitutes to Japanese soldiers, the use of biological weapons, and so on. But now, Japanese textbooks have got that almost written out. There's still an absolute refusal amongst Japanese government ministers to say we will tell history as it really is. We must glorify the past, not admit the truth. And of course, a prime example, which takes the last part of this chapter, is Russia. And one thinks of the way in which Vladimir Putin has closed down the main archives in Russia, how he has made sure that the propaganda about the war in Ukraine is almost a complete distortion of what is actually happening. But Putin didn't start telling lies about Russia at the time of invading Ukraine. He came to power in 2009. Very soon, the so-called liberal hero who'd taken over Russia started insisting that Russian textbooks, history textbooks, should change. And he's been on a campaign for at least the last decade or more to make sure that anyone who tried to tell the truth about the Stalin years couldn't get their books published. He allowed at one point in his early years for such books to be published. But now, no, he says, we've got to glorify the Russian past. And that's hugely dangerous. And it's not just Putin. In November, the New York Times had on its front page the story that President Xi had said, without any sense of irony or one might say shame, he was going to have Chinese history rewritten. What on earth was he up to? So there's history and history. And one doesn't have to look at China, Japan, or Russia. In the United States, there's an absolute divide between the 1619 project, critical race theory, the 1776 commission that ex-President Trump set up, a refusal, particularly I think for the 1776 crowd, to dare to say, let us have history written as objectively as possible. Now, objectivity is an agenda also. And there's a wonderful moment in Tom Stoppard's play, Night and Day, where one of the journalists says, well, my paper, we're objective. We're really objective. And a fellow journalist says to him, yeah, but are you objective for or objective against? So I would say that there is a way in which we can, through gradual accretions, come to some understanding of what is true about the past. We may not know who built Stonehenge or why or how, but we do know that Elvis Presley is dead. Although, come to think of it, there's a recent survey that said 43% of Americans thought he was still alive. And I'm not just picking on Americans. It's a British survey of school children who said, Robin Hood was true, and King Arthur, he existed. Winston Churchill, no. So, at the end of all this, I am going just to read about what a historian ideally should be. And it comes right at the end of the book. And it comes from a review that an American historian wrote, a man called William Prescott, who in his day was called the American Thucydides. I mean, he's a mid-19th century figure who is absolutely forgotten now. And it's all I talk to well-read American friends, and they just have never heard of him. And yet, he wrote 11 books, The Conquest of Mexico, The Conquest of Peru, a wonderful, wonderful history. And hugely colourful narratives, which is all the more amazing because from his student days at Harvard on, he was 95% blind. And for any one day, he was allowed to read for half an hour in 5-minute gobbets. And yet he produced these long, amazingly ambitious books. Anyway, in 1829, he wrote a review of Washington Irving's Conquest of Granada, and he considered the question of what a historian should ideally be, concluding that such a paragon must be strictly impartial, a lover of truth under all circumstances, and ready to declare it at all hazards. He must be deeply conversant with whatever may bring into relief the character of the people he is depicting, not merely with their laws, constitution, general resources, and all the other more visible parts of the machinery of government, but with the nicer moral and social relations, the informing spirit which gives life to the whole. Now, he wasn't done yet. He must be, no she at this point, you notice, he must be conscientious in his attention to geography, chronology, and so on, and inaccuracy, which has been fatal to more than one good philosophical history. And mixed up with all these drier details, he must display the various powers of a novelist or dramatist, throwing his characters into suitable lights and shades, disposing his scenes so as to awaken and maintain an unflagging interest, and diffusing over the whole that finished style without which his work will only become a magazine of materials. He must be, in short, there is no end to what a perfect historian must be and do. It is hardly necessary to add that such a monster never did and never will exist. Thank you. Now you're open to ask me a whole lot of questions which I won't be able to answer.
You mentioned John Keegan, who of course transitioned, from academia to popular history. somebody like Ken Burns, the documentarian, is probably responsible these days for providing more history to Americans than probably most authors. And I'm curious, where do you put a documentarian like that on the spectrum?
Well, if I may, I would just say that John Keegan never came out of academia. I know he taught at Sandhurst for years, but his first 3 books were really quickie military histories to get some money. And when he later applied to be a professor of history at Oxford, and his predecessor in that post, I think he published a guide to church pews in the 19th century. Otherwise, hadn't done anything. They wouldn't take John because he said he hadn't gone through the normal step-by-step ladder towards academic acceptance. But that's just interesting in terms of, you know, how one takes John. Ken Burns, I spend quite a bit of time on because I think that his 13-part series on the American Civil War is best, with all its faults, he does have faults, and Ken Burns will admit to some of them, is the best piece of documentary history that we've ever had on television. And many of his other documentaries, on Prohibition or Ernest Hemingway, must be a dozen of them now, I think are remarkable works of history. And in fact, John Burrow, who I was mentioning, says that he thinks he's one of the great historians of our time. And it's interesting, in terms of getting the facts right, after the book was published, I got a letter. I'm looking at my wife to say, should I be saying this? Can I vow them to silence? Secrecy? All right. Can I give the general principle? No. It shows me in a good light, maybe Ken Burns not, because I do like him very much, so we'll skip over that. But they did say, look, you say all these things about Ken Burns and his documentaries. Maybe we can work together. Would you put to us a notion of what a series that Ken Burns could make, and you could be the voiceover? So at present, I'm thinking of suggesting that he do a documentary series called A History of Bad Historians. But that's how I place him. I also write about Henry Louis Gates, whom I think has been absolutely remarkable in what he's done using the medium of television. See, I was good. Yes.
I recently reread.
I'm going to come closer to you because.
Let me take this down. Hopefully healthy. I recently reread, because it's an entertaining, Norman Cantor's book on medieval historians. I assume you sort of, at least are aware of it if you haven't read it.
What do I think?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to comment. Yeah, basically, I was asking, what do you think? Because he looked at the personality quirks of basically groups of historians who, in effect, define most of us to know about the Middle Ages, those of us who care about the period. And, you know, like he looked at ecclesiastical historians such as David Knowles, who wrote about the various religious orders in England, you know, during the 12th and 13th century. But he also then looked at the fact that Knowles had affairs with women, even though he himself was a monk. And, you know, it's gossip. You said it, that
well,
your book was
there's
praised
a
almost as being
wonderful
good gossip, and Cantor is basically a certain level of gossip.
Well, there's a wonderful
entertaining
British
stuff.
historian called Felipe Hernandez Almesto, and I went to see him. He had written a commentary actually on William Hickling Prescott, and he said in an accent I can't, or maybe shouldn't try to imitate, that, oh, Richard, you're not going to be so boring as to start your book with hello, little Sayo. So I thought, well, I don't want to be boring. So I start, not exactly with Cantor, but with David Knowles.
Yeah.
Because when I was at school, at high school, I was at the age of 13 put into a class run by, my school was run by Benedictine monks. And we were studying for history S level, as it's called, kind of the university paper. And the special paper was on the dissolution of the monasteries in 1536. And the person who was the great authority on that period was David Knowles, who was then Regius Professor of History at Cambridge. But his view on what had happened to the monks was they really had it coming to them. They were dissolute, greedy, both after money, food, drink, anything. They
He
were
was kicked
not.
out of his order for the same.
They were not living according to the rules of Benedict. And that's when it actually first occurred to me that David Knowles may have been professor at Cambridge, but he'd been a monk at Downside Abbey when I was at school, and had actually been kicked out of the monastery for trying to foment a rebellion there, on the lines that the monks who were his colleagues in the community weren't living a proper Benedictine life. And he got shoved off to a small priory in West London. And that's where he started writing. And in fact, the Abbey and indeed the Vatican were saying, well, we want to kick him out because quite obviously he's not obeying the rule. He's criticized not just his abbot, but he was writing letters to the papacy saying the Pope had to go. But he produced the first volume of his work on medieval religious life in England and Wales, and it became a classic. It immediately won wonderful reviews. So the papacy and the Benedictine order in particular had to think, well, he's rather a good person to boast about, but we want to get rid of him, but we can't. And so there was this crazy time. And I wrote to the then present abbot of Downside saying, could I come and see him? And the abbot wrote back and said, yes, I studied at Cambridge. I did my doctorate under David Knowles. And so I went down to this school, which is about half an hour's run outside Bath in southwest England, and met the abbot. And he said, I've been thinking about David Knowles. You know, we have his unpublished autobiography in the monastery library. And my heart missed a beat. And he said, you know, we've got 3 different versions of it. Gibbon, in order to get his reputation across, wrote 5 different versions of his autobiography. The 3 was quite good to be getting on with. And so I read these 3 versions, and sometimes whole passages were scored out in heavy red ink, as if emotionally he was determined that a particular paragraph should go. And he described how, while he was at this priory in West London, and that the prior there said, oh, Father David, there's a woman who wants some spiritual advice. And so David Knowles said, well, I'll meet her. And in came this not particularly attractive, mid-30s Swedish psychiatrist, quite successful professional psychiatrist. And he heard her confession. And she said, well, actually, I've got nothing to confess. And it turned out that she was so rigorous a Christian that she tried to go to confession once a day, every day, which is actually against the rules of Catholicism. But one day, the prior discovered, that David Knowles had totally vanished. He'd left the priory, taking just a couple of books and a few bits of clothing with him. And he'd gone off with this woman. And as opposed to him having lots of affairs, he lived the rest of his life with this woman in what I believe was a non-sexual relationship. For matters of convenience, they would sometimes call themselves Mr. and Mrs. Knowles. But for various reasons to do with his personal health, he couldn't have performed in a sexual relationship anyway. But Cantor writes about this. And you go back to, well, this is gossip. What's all this? Writing about the sexual performance of Benedictine monks? We should close our ears to such things. But this is the person who wrote books about a pretty long period, 800 to 1500s, in terms of religious life in England then, when religious life was hugely important. The number of monasteries and convents, of traveling friars and so on, would beg belief in terms of the dominance and range of such people. So there again, you have it. Yes, Cantor did write most wonderfully about Knowles, and this wasn't a planted question, I have to say.
It wasn't really a scurrilous, I mean, not scurrilous is the wrong word, it wasn't, sexually gossiping, especially. There's a word for that I'm missing. But he also wrote that there's a couple of historians who were very sympathetic to the Nazis, who were Cantorics, and I don't remember the other tell his name.
No, he is wonderful.
It's a wonderful book.
As Cantor comes from to sing, he really does sing. But there you are, you said Knowles had all these mistresses, all these loves.
I was wrong.
That's your history.
Yeah.
And of course, what I would say in your defense is sometimes prejudice history is wonderful reading. And a prejudiced
My
historian.
memory, I'd be able to guess right here, is a sometimes thing, and I may be misremembering Cantor also.
Maybe your truth is greater than we know. Because one of the things about historians, whatever kind of historian they are, but certainly the academic historian, is always trying to be one up on the historians who've gone before him.
I just
or
threw
her.
out Cantor because of you saying about history as being interesting gossip.
Yeah.
And his book was just such a prime example
No, you're absolutely right.
of interesting gossip.
Yes.
Oh, what do you think of Will and Ariel Durand?
The phrase that just came into my mind was they were great popularizers, but I think that undersells them. Because they weren't part of the academic establishment, they were looked upon as writing a popular version of history. But I found them wonderfully readable, and they wrote with tremendous authority. And it's an extraordinary expanse. They're 12 volumes.
I don't know, I think they're
on-
wonderful though too. And apparently their motive was for people who were workers, came home exhausted at the end of the day, you know, something that they were able to read. I find them extraordinary.
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
And you know, popularizing can mean dumbing down, but in their case, I absolutely think it didn't. They were extraordinarily well read, and they wrote beautifully. So if people haven't read Will Durand and his wife, that would be one tip I'd give you for this evening.
They were heroes of the Book of the Month Club
Well,
50 years ago.
Yeah, what a shame that Book of the Month Club is no longer with us.
But almost everybody.
Well, the details were so wonderful. His children asked him if dogs went to heaven. They had a dog. And he said, yes, of course, but nobody asked about cats. But what a marvelous detail, you know.
Yes.
Richard, these days, Americans are being fed so much in these lies, not history. Whether it's through the Murdoch or through the internet, how do you think it would be possible to get Americans somehow to pay attention to history?
Well, it goes back to me as something, I think, saying we've got to defend history. And it's not just the right wing of America who are defending their position in American society. The problem of false news is worldwide. And the internet gives an extraordinary quality to research, an extraordinary means to people who are writing books. But of course, it's become true throughout the world that people don't know what's true and what's false. So it's not just an American problem, and whether it's Twitter or Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn or all these means which are so important in people's lives, how do we know what we can take as true, what not? And the only thing that can happen is, as I said, the accretion of trustworthy views so that finally the truth will come out. If enough people say that Putin is fighting a war and not just exercising his military in Ukraine, then that will become a truth. But it will take time. Solzhenitsyn said the truth about Stalin's Soviet Union will come out, but it will take a very long time. And that, I'm afraid, may be true in terms of what the majority of Russians regard as what is true and what is false in recent events. So it really is a battle, and it comes down to that simple thing which I started off with. History has two meanings, and to preserve the first, we've got to be absolutely on our guard about what we take in of the second.
I think that's an extremely resonant note on which to conclude. Thank you so much, Richard Cohen. Thank you, audience online.